The town of Ashford Hollow had not seen a new face in nearly 3 years. Hidden in the dense folds of Missouri's southern woods, the town was stitched together by old rituals, rusting rail lines, and a single whitewashed church that stood like a tooth jutting from the jaw of the earth. They came in wagons, on foot, with baskets of bread and jarred peaches to meet him. The man who stepped down from the carriage wasn't what they expected. Father Anselm, they called him, a tall, pale-faced priest with a crooked collar and fingers too long for a man of God. He carried no trunk, only a single black valise, and a worn leather Bible wrapped in a chain. His smile was the kind that made even the bravest dogs turn away. Reverend Bellamy, who'd led the town until the fire of '77, had left without a word. The two who followed after him had stayed less than a season each. One drowned in the nearby marsh, the other simply disappeared one morning, his horse still tethered to the chapel gate. But the bishop had sent this one personally, with papers his own seal and a strange instruction. Let him do as he sees fit. Do not interfere. That line haunted Mayor Cullum more than any other. Still, the town needed Sunday sermons, funerals, and weddings. Without a priest, the bones of Ashford Hollow had started to rattle. The townsfolk gathered at the church that first Sunday. The steeple bells hadn't rung in months, and when Anselm pulled the rope, it let out a low, metallic groan, like a warning whispered from above. The inside of St. Aveline's chapel was as they remembered it, simple, wooden, filled with dust motes and the scent of mildew. But Anselm walked straight past the pews to the altar. He bent low, as if listening to something buried within the floorboards. After a moment, he touched the base of the crucifix. This was not carved by any Christian, he muttered, then turned back and smiled at the silent congregation. That evening, he began his journal. March 12, 1882. The altar has been hollowed beneath. Symbols, pre-Christian. Etchings I dare not yet describe. They do not speak of divinity. The people are kind, if a bit watchful. They know something. I must uncover what. By the third night, he had found the trapdoor. It was hidden beneath a warped panel behind the altar, covered in dust and faint scratches like claw marks. He opened it by candlelight. Stairs descended into the darkness. The air that escaped was ancient, and with it came the smell of wet earth and burnt feathers. He descended 5 steps before he heard it, chanting, soft and rhythmic. But there was no one below. When he returned to his room behind the church, he could not sleep. That night, he dreamt of a congregation with hollow faces, seated in the pews, staring with burned-out eyes, lips moving in silent prayer. At the altar, a goat with a human voice delivered a sermon about fire, sacrifice, and eternity. The next day, he asked the old groundskeeper, Mr. Derry, about the space beneath the church. There's nothing there, Father. Just stone and earth. Been that way since I was a boy, Derry lied, avoiding his gaze. That evening, Anselm wandered through the cemetery behind the chapel. The gravestones were crooked, half swallowed by moss, the names barely legible. But what he noticed most was this: no grave dated after 1879. Where were the dead of the past 3 years? His journal grew darker. March 14th. The town lies, or they forget. Both are dangerous. The ground murmurs at night. The altar is older than the building, older than the town. By the week's end, Anselm had mapped the etchings beneath the church. They formed a spiral, curving inward toward a central emblem, a black flame inverted. He recognized the symbol. It was forbidden even in the deepest theological texts, a relic from early Coptic heresies, cast out by the church as madness. But here it was, carved beneath the very altar he now stood behind each morning. He began preaching strange sermons, not blasphemous, but different, emphasizing fire, judgment, and the purifying of the soul through suffering. Some townsfolk felt unease, others awe. The pews began to fill again. But more than a few said they dreamt, after his sermons, of black smoke curling through cracks in the floor and voices whispering their name from beneath the chapel. One woman, old Mrs. Greaves, claimed she saw shadowy figures move through the windows of a church at night, even when it was locked from the inside. When confronted, Father Anselm only smiled and said, "Faith often attracts those who have none, even in death." His journal, now locked in his room, recorded a final line before the next Sabbath. March 18th. The spiral is complete. The fire longs for mouths. 80 is the number. As it was written. As it must be. That Sunday was to be the largest congregation in Ashford Hollow since the town's founding. 80 souls, seated in tight rows, clutching in books, and fanning themselves against the heavy, suffocating heat that had somehow gathered inside the church, even as a cold mist clung outside. Father Anselm stood at the pulpit. His eyes were distant. His voice deepened. The chapel doors shut behind them by unseen hands. The fire would come soon, but no one knew yet. The night wind carried no weight. The trees stood still. Even the owls refused to speak. But somewhere in the velvet silence of Elm Hollow, a solitary sound broke the calm, the ringing of the old church bell. Anselm woke with a jolt. The room was still dark, only the thin light of the crescent moon pressed against the frost-glazed windows. He sat up, drenched in sweat, heart hammering. The tolling echoed in his ears, not like a memory, but as if it still rang outside. Deep, hollow, relentless. He knew the bell's voice well, its pitch, its pause between strokes. And this was no dream. It was real. He pulled on his coat and boots over his nightclothes, lit his lantern, and slipped out into the cold. The town was sleeping. Not even the dogs stirred as he passed down the dirt path toward the church on the hill. Its silhouette loomed, crooked, scorched in parts from the fire that had supposedly been quenched. The steeple pointed like a bony finger into the sky, and as he neared, the sound became more distinct. The bell still rang. It was impossible. The bell rope had been cut months ago, after the fire. No one had gone up to the belfry since, not after they found the charred bones of birds scattered across the floorboards. And yet now the bell tolled. He reached the church doors, pushed them open, and froze. Inside was colder than outside. No wind entered through the cracks, but a chill lived here, curling around the pews and bleeding from the walls. His lantern's glow could barely stretch beyond a few feet. The rope, it moved, slowly, steadily, as if being pulled from above by invisible hands. Anselm stared in disbelief. Each pull made the bell above groan and ring again. He stepped closer, heart thudding in his chest. He reached for the rope. The moment his fingers brushed it, the motion stopped. The church fell into silence. The bell's final echo seemed to bounce endlessly in the rafters before vanishing altogether. And then came the scent, acrid, pungent, unmistakable. Burning wood, burning flesh. He turned sharply. The air shimmered above the altar. The wood near the pulpit was darker than the rest, blistered and stained. He could almost hear whispers between the pews, like voices without mouths, crying without lungs. He backed away slowly and exited the church, locking the doors behind him. But even as he stepped into the crisp night air, his soul remained captive. That night, Anselm dreamed the fire. But it wasn't just a replay. It was something worse. He was inside the church, the same as before, but there was no congregation, no priest, no hymns. Only shadows. The walls were aflame. Smoke writhed like serpents through the air, but the fire made no sound. People screamed, but their mouths didn't open. Their skin peeled without pain. Their eyes stared at him, accusing, burning. He woke up choking. It had been 2 weeks since the first fire, but it was as if the heat still lived in his lungs. In the daylight, everything seemed more rational. The bell might have loosened due to wood warping from past heat, he told himself. The wind might have carried strange smells. Dreams were dreams. But his thoughts were shattered when the sheriff's boy, Thomas, came running. "Brother Anselm," the boy yelled. "It's Grace. Grace Pembry. She's gone. Grace. 7 years old. The quietest of the Pembry children. Always stayed after church to light candles." Anselm's breath caught. He followed the boy back to the Pembry home. Mrs. Pembry sat collapsed on the steps, rocking in place, her hands clutching Grace's bonnet. She went out to pick flowers near the old cemetery. The mother sobbed. Said she heard someone calling. A voice she knew. We told her not to go. The sheriff's men had already begun searching the woods, combing the area behind the graveyard. But Anselm didn't join them. He walked instead toward the church. The cemetery lay beside it, worn gravestones bowing under centuries of rain. Some names had been lost to time. Others were buried in ivy. But the church itself, it watched. He felt it now more than ever, as if it were awake. The bell was silent, but the air was too still again. He climbed the steps and stood at the doors, hand hovering above the iron handle. He turned slowly and looked back toward the woods. A single white ribbon fluttered from a thorn bush. Grace's ribbon. But the bush was on the church side of the hill. She had come this way. He opened the door. Inside, everything looked untouched, yet wrong. The scent of ash lingered again. On the pulpit sat one of Grace's shoes, small, brown, laced. Anselm stumbled backward, knocking into a pew. The silence that followed was deafening. Then the bell tolled once, loud, sharp, final. But no one had touched the rope. No wind had passed. The sound vibrated through Anselm's bones, and with it came something deeper, a memory not his own. Images flashed, faces twisted in fear, fire licking wooden beams, prayers swallowed by smoke, a door bolted from the inside. He left the church without closing the door behind him. He could not speak of what he'd seen. Not yet. Not even to himself. All he knew was that Grace was gone, and the church was not done. The church bells rang, 3 solemn tolls echoing through the sleepy town of Elmsbrook. The sun filtered in through the stained glass windows, spilling fractured beams of red, violet, and gold across the cold wooden pews. Father Anselm stood at the pulpit, hands trembling beneath the worn sleeves of his cassock. The congregation, nearly all 80 souls, sat still as gravestones, their faces raised to him in reverent attention. He cleared his throat and began to preach. His voice, though weakened by restless nights and a gnawing weight in his chest, echoed off the high vaulted ceiling. For the Lord sees not as man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. The line flowed out of him like breath, but then something stopped him cold. A murmur rose, not quite an echo, not quite a whisper. He paused. The congregation, eyes glazed and still, began to repeat the words. Exactly, word for word. For the Lord sees not as man sees. 80 voices recited, slow and hollow, like the wind moaning through broken shutters. He staggered back from the pulpit, breath caught in his throat. The church creaked. The wooden beams above groaned, as if bearing some great weight. Outside, the wind howled through the barren trees, but inside, a stillness pressed on everything like invisible hands. Then the organ played. No hands on the keys. No organist. Just a sound, low ancient, a slow dirge that crawled along the walls like smoke. Father Anselm turned toward the choir loft. Empty. Dust motes danced in the colored light. The sound twisted, distorted chords that shouldn't belong together, yet did. They throbbed through the floorboards, up his spine. He turned back to the congregation. All eyes on him. No one blinking. Sister Maureen, third pew from the front, mouth parted slightly, was bleeding from her nose. He stepped down, nearly stumbling. "Sisters, brothers," he called, forcing calm. "The Lord, He tests us. He tests us, but we must not lose faith." They smiled, every single one of them, wide, unblinking grins. And then they blinked all at once. Like a single creature, he dropped his Bible. It landed with a thud that seemed too loud. The echo of it did not fade. Instead, it grew, looping, building, until the church itself seemed to chant the verse. "But the Lord looks on the heart." The words scratched at the inside of his skull. He ran from the altar, down the side aisle, through the heavy wooden door to the vestry. He slammed it shut behind him and slumped to the floor. His heart was pounding. He could still hear the organ. He could still hear them speaking. Or perhaps not them. Something else. That night, he lit only a single candle in his study and began to write in his journal, the same leather-bound book in which he had catalogued every Sunday sermon, every confession, every birth and death in Elmsbrook over the past 2 decades. The ink bled into the parchment as his hand trembled. October 17th, 1882. They spoke with one voice. But their eyes, there was nothing in them. "I fear they are no longer my flock." The church listens. The church remembers. The church speaks back. He sat in silence, the candle flickering violently, though no window was open, no breeze present. The wooden crucifix above the door tilted ever so slightly to the left. He had tried to sleep in his bed the night before, but the mattress felt too soft, too warm, as if someone else had just risen from it. He'd lain awake, listening to the floorboards shift. He began to suspect the church never emptied, that something remained within it long after the last person left, watching. The next morning, he tried to ask Sister Maureen if she recalled anything from the sermon. She only smiled and said, "His words were inside us, Father. All of us. Like always." He asked the choir boy, Tomas, if he'd gone up to the organ during service. "No, Father," Tomas said. "It plays itself now. Doesn't it always?" Father Anselm stepped back, unnerved. He walked the perimeter of the church that evening, whispering prayers, sprinkling holy water on the lintels and sills. The wind snapped at his robe. He thought he saw figures in the woods, just beyond the fence. Dozens. Watching. But when he blinked, they were gone. 3 days later, a man named Charles from the lumberyard burst into confession mid-afternoon, screaming, "There's something beneath the floor. It's breathing, Father. I heard it. It mimics my voice. It said it would take my wife." Anselm locked the church for the first time in its long history. That night, the bells rang 12 times on their own. He stood at the foot of the altar and whispered, "In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, I command you to reveal yourself." The candlelight guttered, and from the darkened pews, the congregation replied in one voice, though none were visibly present, "You already have." He fled again to his journal, his only confidant. "I fear I was never meant to lead this flock. Something older than Scripture claims this house. The voice is not of God, but it knows Scripture better than I ever could. It doesn't want worship. It wants witness." His hand bled where the quill slipped. By the end of the week, he stopped delivering sermons. The church still filled on Sundays. No one spoke. They just sat, for hours, listening, waiting. Sometimes, Father Anselm would stand just behind the cracked door, watching. And sometimes he could hear the church humming to itself. A low tune, old as the stone that built it. He didn't know how to stop it. He only knew this: the church was no longer a house of God. It had become a mouth, and it was learning how to speak. The bell tower still stood, a scorched monument towering over a sea of ruin, its once pure bronze now blackened with soot and time. The wind howled through its broken frame like a mourning widow, rattling the twisted iron that had once signaled prayer. Beneath it, the remnants of St. Elias Chapel whispered forgotten hymns in the language of dust. Sheriff Whitlock had returned. For days after the fire, drawn not by duty, but by guilt, he had grown up kneeling before the altar of St. Elias. The chapel's burned husk felt personal, like a body exhumed. He stepped cautiously over fallen beams and brittle, charcoal-streaked pews, each creak beneath his boots sounding like the cries of the dead. He stopped near what was once the pulpit, now a jagged, collapsed mess of timber and scorched holy texts. The altar stone remained cracked, but unburnt. A black Bible rested on it, open to a page fused to the stone by heat. Matthew 10 verse 28. Fear him who can destroy both soul and body in hell. Whitlock swallowed hard. This wasn't just destruction. This was cleansing. He scanned the ash-stained floor, the glint of broken glass from stained windows, and a strange trail, faint but deliberate, curving around the altar and disappearing beneath the collapsed choir loft. He followed it. Behind a hanging tapestry, half-burned and dangling like a torn veil, he found the trapdoor. He remembered it. The old maintenance cellar. The priest used it to store baptismal fonts, winter wood, and things the congregation never saw. He yanked the iron ring, and it gave with a moan that chilled his spine. A wave of damp air rose from the pit, thick with rot and smoke. Lantern in hand, he descended the narrow stone steps, its cold walls slick with condensation. The cellar smelled of charred flesh. Below, the narrow space opened into a surprisingly large chamber. Rough-hewn rock and brick walls lined with shelves. Jars of melted wax, old linens, shattered wine bottles. But in the far corner, something moved. A figure, hunched, skeletal. The lantern's glow flickered against the pale face of a man covered in ash. His eyes glistened with tears, and his lips trembled in silent prayer. It was Brother Aldrich, the chapel's caretaker. He had vanished the night of the fire. Yet here he was, kneeling before a scorched wooden crucifix stabbed into the dirt. Whitlock whispered, "Brother Aldrich?" The old man did not turn. His voice was low, raspy, shaped by days of smoke and scripture. "They burned from the inside," Aldrich said. "Not from flame, from faith twisted into something else." Whitlock stepped closer, the lantern trembling in his grip. "What happened here?" Aldrich finally looked at him. His eyes were haunted, hollow. They weren't worshippers, Sheriff. They were chosen. They came to witness the summoning, the sacrifice. I begged Father Mallory to stop. But he said the time had come. The time for what? For returning what was buried. Aldrich pointed toward the rear wall of the chamber. A faint red glow pulsed from cracks in the stone, like light trapped beneath the earth. The sheriff moved cautiously, brushing aside a curtain of cobwebs to reveal a hidden crevice. Beyond it, an older room, circular and far colder. Symbols lined the floor, drawn in ash and dried blood. Candles, long melted, stood atop skulls. Bones were stacked like sacred relics. At the center sat a shallow pit, empty. The offering was made, Aldrich whispered behind him. They stood in a circle, reciting the old words. 80 tongues, 80 hearts. They called it up from beneath. What did they call up? Brother Aldrich's face twisted. "Something that doesn't die," he croaked. "It sleeps. It watches. And when it wakes, it feeds." Whitlock felt his knees weaken. This was no simple chapel fire. It was a rite, a mass communion with something darker than hell. And somehow, the chapel had become the mouth through which it had spoken. Aldrich suddenly clutched the sheriff's coat. "They're not gone," he hissed. "Not really. The fire didn't consume them. It freed them." Then his eyes rolled back, and he collapsed. The lantern's flame flickered violently, shadows warping along the chamber's walls. Somewhere behind him, something creaked, slow, deliberate, like bare feet on stone. Whitlock turned, drawing his revolver. But there was nothing there, only silence, and the faint, rhythmic sound of whispering voices echoing from deep within the earth. The town of Bellbrook had begun to forget. Already, The charred remains of the chapel were being swept under the rug of polite silence. The townspeople called it a tragedy. They lit candles, they brought flowers, they cried, but they didn't ask questions. Not real ones. It was as if some invisible hand had pressed down on the town's collective memory, erasing the unnatural from their thoughts. But Sheriff Whitlock remembered. He hadn't slept in 3 nights. In his office, the journal of Father Mallory lay open on his desk. He had found it hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the chapel's rectory, untouched by flame. The leather was cracked and smelled of sulfur. Its pages were covered in ink and blood. As the sheriff read, dread rose in his chest like smoke through a chimney. Mallory had written of dreams, nightmares shared by his entire congregation, dreams of a great figure wrapped in burning wings, a choir of hollow voices that sang in reverse, of waking up to scratches beneath the floorboards of the altar. They came not for forgiveness, but for fire, the blessed flame, the reaping angel, the mouth beneath Bellbrook that must feed. Whitlock's fingers trembled as he turned the page. If 80 souls burn in praise, the gate will crack. If the ash is undisturbed, the path will remain sealed. But if one soul survives, only one, the hunger will crawl out through the wound, and it will never sleep again. One soul, Brother Aldrich. The sheriff returned to the clinic that same afternoon, but the nurse met him at the door with panic in her eyes. "He's gone," she said. "We sedated him. Locked the door. When I came back, the bed was empty. But there was ash, piles of ash everywhere." "Where did he go?" The nurse's voice dropped to a whisper. "He kept saying, 'He's still in the woods. He's still in the woods.'" Whitlock's heart froze. The woods. The Bellbrook forest was ancient. Its trees were twisted like arthritic fingers, draped in moss and mystery. No bird sang there, not anymore. The trail that led from the chapel's backside had long since overgrown, but Whitlock knew where to step. He had played there as a child, before the forest had turned strange, before people began saying it felt wrong. The wind didn't move through the leaves. The air was still, suffocating. About a mile in, he found it. A clearing. A perfect circle, where no trees grew, where the grass was singed black. In the center stood a wooden effigy, crudely shaped like a man, with bones tied into its chest like ribs. Around its feet were dozens of melted candles, some still warm. And at the base of the effigy, something knelt. It was Aldrich, naked, shaking, covered in soot. He was muttering, his voice cracked and wet. "Forgive me. Forgive me. I thought I could stop it. I thought." Whitlock approached cautiously. "Brother, we have to leave. Now." But Aldrich didn't look at him. He looked through him. They called him sheriff. They opened the gate and burned themselves into its mouth. But I stayed. I didn't burn. So it stayed hungry. The sheriff stepped forward, hand on his revolver. "Aldrich, come with me, please." Suddenly, the man's body convulsed. His spine arched back violently, and he screamed, not in pain, but in rapture. Flames burst from his mouth, just a flicker, then vanished. His skin steamed. Smoke coiled from his pores. Then, he ignited. Like a wick set alight, his entire body burst into blue fire. Whitlock staggered back in horror as the man didn't flinch, didn't run, didn't even burn like flesh should. The fire clung to him unnaturally, whispering in tongues. Aldrich opened his eyes one last time, and through the flames, the sheriff saw not a man, but something ancient, hollow, and hateful. And then he was gone, nothing but ash, scattered by the wind. The sheriff stumbled backward, tripping over tree roots, falling to his knees in the moss. Then he heard it, a sound like breath, not his own. From the trees around the clearing, dozens of voices began to hum a single, low note, at first barely audible, then rising. The trees seemed to lean inward, their trunks vibrating with unseen life. Whitlock turned wildly, revolver raised, but he saw no one, until he looked up. High in the branches, shadows, not bodies. shapes, black silhouettes, hanging upside down like cocoons. The outlines of human forms, draped in vine and smoke. Their faces were blank, their arms extended toward the center of the clearing, fingers outstretched in silent worship. Whitlock bolted. He ran like a man pursued by God's own judgment. That night, back in his home, he locked every door, nailed the windows shut, lit every lantern. But still, he could hear them, whispering beneath the floorboards, scratching at the glass. In his dreams, he saw the chapel whole again, lit with fire, filled with singing. He saw the townspeople among the pews, their skin charred, their eyes glowing like coals. And always he saw the thing in the pit, the thing they had fed, the thing that had now tasted life and wanted more. The night air in Blackburn was thick with silence until it wasn't. At exactly 3:14 a.m., a sound echoed through the hollowed bones of the burned-down chapel, the unmistakable clang of a bell. It cut through the quiet like a razor through cloth. 80 slow, deliberate tolls. Measured. Final. Each one dragged through the soul, like a weight tied to memory. But there was no bell. There hadn't been one since the fire devoured the chapel, its steeple crumbling, its foundations cracked open like a grave. No metal, no rope, no tower remained. Just blackened stones, ash-choked pews, and soot where faith once lived. Yet the town heard it. All of them. Doors creaked open across Blackburn. Lights flickered to life. Faces peered through windows. Children wept in their beds. Dogs howled. And somewhere in the center of it all, something unseen shifted beneath the ruins. The next night, it rang again. Same time. Same number of tolls. By the third night, the people of Blackburn no longer wondered if the sound was real. They began to dread why it returned. Sheriff Elias Callum stood on the cracked stone steps where the chapel's front doors had once been. His breath misted, though summer clung stubbornly to the fields. He gripped his revolver tightly, jaw clenched, eyes scanning the ruined frame of the sanctuary. Behind him, a few brave locals watched from a distance, some clutching Bibles, others rosaries, most just holding each other. The sheriff had made a declaration that evening. He would put an end to the nonsense. If someone was playing tricks, he'd catch them. If it was something else, well, he wasn't a man who backed down. The clock ticked toward the minute. 3:14 a.m. The first toll rang out, louder than before, as if something had grown stronger. Elias flinched. His ears rang. He turned in a slow circle. There was no source, no vibrations in the ground, no echo from a hidden place. Just the sound. Then another toll. And another. 80 in total. And when it ended, the silence that followed was worse. It pressed down like a weight. Thick. Listening. By morning, the sheriff was gone. His boots were discovered neatly placed at the base of the ruined altar. Inside them, only a pile of warm ash. 3 days later, a new voice arrived in town, young Reverend Marlon Howe from St. Louis. His white collar was clean, his hands uncalloused, and his voice full of certainty. "This is grief," he told the town square, standing beneath the old sycamore tree. "You've given shape to sorrow. The bell you hear is guilt, not God." He gathered a group of volunteers that night. They brought lanterns, notebooks, and a phonograph to record any sound. They stood within the chapel's charred outline, some marking runes in the dirt, others praying under their breath. 3:14 a.m. arrived. The bell rang, but not from above. It came from below. One of the volunteers, a young schoolteacher, fell to her knees, clawing at her ears. "It's inside me," she sobbed. "It's ringing in my bones." Another screamed that he saw shadows in the fire-blackened rafters, but there were no rafters left. Just smoke hanging low like a veil. Reverend Howe held his ground until the 80th toll. Then something cracked in the center of the stone floor. A hairline fracture that glowed red as embers. From it, a whisper rose, low and wet, like breath through teeth. All 7 were found at dawn, laid flat across the ruins, arms crossed like the dead. eyes wide, ears bleeding, tongues bitten. Only Reverend House survived, though madness claimed him. He could not speak, nor sleep. He simply stared at nothing day and night, until his family brought him back to St. Louis in a locked wagon. After that, the tolling no longer stayed at 3:14. It rang again at 4:07, then at 5:22, then 3 times in one night. Always 80 tolls. Always louder. By now, the town's map felt like a haunted pattern. People began marking the times and directions. They noticed strange weather during each event. Frost in the fields, mirrors fogging without cause, animals refusing to cross the road near the chapel site. Old Eliza Marin, who had once cleaned chalices and mended altar cloths for the church, declared it plainly one morning. "They're not ringing a bell," she said. "They're opening a door." No one laughed. Not anymore. That evening, she drew a circle of powdered bone around her front porch, lit 3 candles in every room. She wrote in her Bible, "If they call me, I will not answer." At 3:14 a.m., her neighbors heard the bell once more. By morning, Eliza was gone. Her doors locked from within. No signs of struggle. Only a single scorched handprint on her front door and a trail of white ash leading toward the chapel. Blackburn began to empty after that. Families packed wagons. Stores closed. Only the stubborn or the damned remained. And in the center of town, the chapel ruins stood quiet in daylight. But each night, as the stars turned and the hours struck, the sound came again. Not a bell, not a song, a summoning. And something, whatever survived the fire, whatever woke beneath the 80 who burned, was listening, and counting, and ringing, because it remembered, and it was not finished. The fields near Black Hollow grew strangely quiet after sundown. Birds no longer sang, and even the insects seemed to avoid the air around the scorched chapel ruins. But for Deputy Ellis, silence was a stranger. Every night, without fail, he heard it. A hymn, soft, eerie, echoing from beneath the ground like the slow murmur of buried souls trying to remember the words. It had started the week after the fire. At first, he thought it was his mind unraveling from guilt. After all, he had stood helpless as the church burned, unable to explain why the flames wouldn't die, why the screams eventually became song. But now, 2 months later, the hymn hadn't stopped. It played when no one else could hear it. Never in the daylight, never on any recording, never while anyone stood beside him. Just him, the dark, and the terrible sound of 80 forgotten voices refusing to be silent. Ellis no longer slept much. He drank more. He spoke less. He moved his cot to the edge of the chapel ruins and kept a journal filled with phrases from the phantom melody. The most repeated line, always whispered at the end. "We burned, but we did not vanish." One night, drawn by a compulsion he couldn't resist, he returned to the blackened pulpit with a lantern and a spade. The pulpit itself had been reduced to cinders, but the stone beneath it had fractured. Something beneath had cracked the rock from below. Ellis knelt down and began to dig. The earth was soft, damp, like disturbed grave soil. 6 inches in, his spade struck something hollow. He reached down, hand trembling, and uncovered a small, child-sized pew, charred but intact. Beneath it, a book, a hymnal, perfectly preserved. The cover bore no soot, no dust. Inside, the pages were blank, until he reached the center. A single hymn was handwritten in dark red ink. The melody was unfamiliar, but the title was unmistakable. "The gathering flame shall sing again." As he read the lyrics aloud, the air thickened around him. The wind stopped. Trees froze. And from the broken foundation of the chapel came the low hum of voices joining his own. He turned, and his breath left his lungs. A congregation stood behind him. Not alive, not dead. Shapes of people barely visible, glowing faintly like ash in the breeze. Men in charred coats, women with melted parasols, children whose eyes were hollow and endless. They weren't moving. They were watching, waiting. He backed away, the hymnal clutched to his chest. As soon as he stopped reading, the spirits vanished like smoke. The wind resumed. But something had shifted. The ground itself had begun to tremble, and beneath his boots, Ellis could hear it more clearly now. Not just a hymn. Footsteps. From below. That night he didn't sleep. He sat with his lantern until morning, the hymnal untouched on the table. Its title now flickered with soot, as if slowly burning from the inside out. The next day, he visited the one person in town who still whispered about the fire. Old Reverend Mathers, the retired minister who had fallen into madness after refusing to attend the new chapel's dedication. Ellis held the hymnal up to the cracked window. "Do you recognize this?" he asked. Mathers screamed. He clawed at the window, shrieking in tongues, until he finally shouted in clear English. "They didn't burn. They became the fire. They sing because they're trapped inside the hymn." And then he collapsed. Ellis fled. That evening, as the sun dipped low behind the ashen trees, he opened the hymnal one last time. The words had changed. Now they read, "You heard us. Now you must finish the song." And when he looked up, they were all there again, lined up in pews that no longer existed, faces solemn, eyes pleading. The hymn began again. This time, it came from his own throat. Deputy Ellis had not returned to his home in days. He had become a fixture of the land where the chapel once stood, a man unraveling thread by thread beneath the weight of a melody no one else could hear. He no longer wore his badge. He no longer responded to calls. His world had narrowed to the brittle soil, the ghostly congregation, and the hymnal that changed each night, writing itself with a will of its own. But as word of Ellis's strange behavior spread, others began to whisper what they had long hidden. Strange sightings. Shadows that danced across burnt pews. The persistent smell of burning pine that clung to their clothes long after passing the site. A young girl claimed to have heard her grandmother's voice humming a lullaby from beneath the ruins, though her grandmother had died in the fire, seated in the third row. And yet no one dared approach, except for Clara Beecham. Clara had survived the fire, or, at least, she claimed she had. She had arrived late that day, she'd overslept, she said, and by the time she reached the chapel, the flames were already devouring the frame. But some didn't believe her story. She had no burns, no soot, no tear-streaked panic, just wide eyes and a silence that made others uneasy. But Clara knew things she shouldn't. She appeared beside Ellis one twilight, barefoot and carrying nothing but a rusted tin lamp and a child's locket. Her voice was calm when she spoke. They weren't supposed to die. Ellis didn't respond. He sat at the edge of the pulpit's cracked stone, his eyes sunken, his mouth dry, the hymnal open in his lap. "They called something they didn't understand," she whispered. "A song older than the church, older than this land." He turned to her, lips trembling. "What are they now?" She looked out toward the blackened foundation, where smoke still occasionally curled up without fire. Her voice dropped to a rasp. "They are part of it. Not ghosts, not souls. They are the hymn now. Each note, a person. Each verse, a memory. Each chorus, a plea for release." Ellis stared at the hymnal. The pages were turning on their own now. Faster, faster, until they stopped on a new phrase, written in ink that pulsed like blood. "Dig, and you will find what anchors them here." Clara knelt beside him and pointed to the altar's deepest stone. Together they began to dig. The soil had changed. No longer soft, it was packed with shards of bone and melted glass, as if the earth had consumed the fire's memory. And the deeper they dug, the colder it became. Their breath steamed in the air. The wind stilled. Trees bent slightly inward. Then clink. Metal. Ellis scraped the dirt away with frantic fingers, revealing the edge of a box. Small. Iron. locked with a seal he didn't recognize, an emblem of a burning sun, split in half. Clara reached out and placed her hand on the seal. The lock hissed, opened. Inside, nestled on black velvet, lay a tongue. Dried, twisted, preserved far beyond nature's rules. Ellis recoiled. "What the hell is that?" Clara whispered, the first voice. The one who led the hymn. They silenced him, buried him alive beneath the church to seal the song. But now it's loose again, and it wants a new tongue. Ellis looked at her with dawning horror. "You knew this all along." She met his gaze with ancient, sorrowful eyes. "I've heard the hymn since I was born. I'm not a survivor. I'm a vessel, just like you." As she spoke, the ground shook. The ruins around them flickered, not with flame, but with memory. The chapel rebuilt itself in pulses of flickering light, wooden beams glowing with ghostly fire, windows shining with stained glass long destroyed. The congregation reappeared in the pews, mouths open, waiting. Ellis stumbled back, but Clara stood firm. "They can't move on until the song ends." "Then end it," he shouted. "I can't," she replied, eyes welling with tears. "You're the last verse." And then she placed the withered tongue into his hand. Ellis felt it burn through his palm like ice. The hymn began again, this time louder, clearer, as though the entire earth was singing from its roots. He fell to his knees, screaming, singing, changing. Behind him, the specters leaned forward in unison. The song was nearly done, but to finish it, someone had to burn. The wind died, the trees stilled, and beneath the ruined chapel, where no fire remained, something began to rise. Deputy Ellis lay collapsed, the iron tongue burning a hole into his skin, but his body would not let go. His mouth opened against his will, and his voice, ragged, hollow, and wrong, began to echo across the broken pews. Domini miserere nobis. It was not his language, not his tone, not his soul. It was the first voice unearthed after half a century of silence. Clara stepped back as a great rumble passed beneath her bare feet. The stone altar cracked down the middle. The black soil surged upward, and beneath it wooden stairs emerged, ancient, charred, and lined with claw marks. Ellis stood, or rather, something within him stood, guiding his limbs like a puppet with strings made of blood and fire. His eyes rolled white. He turned to Clara, mouth still moving in incantation. "The sermon begins beneath the roots. Follow or burn with the silence." And with that, he began to descend into the earth. Clara hesitated. The congregation flickered in and out of view above the chapel floor, their heads slowly turning toward her. Dozens of eyeless faces, smiling, waiting. She stepped down. The stairs creaked with ancient protest. The air grew colder, thick with the rot of long-buried secrets. Carvings lined the stone walls now, primitive, spiraled symbols etched by burned fingertips. Some showed twisted forms kneeling before a sun that wept blood. Others, choirs of the dead singing into a black sky. They passed no torches, but the space pulsed with its own light, a cold, crimson glow that seemed to come from beneath the walls themselves. As they reached the final step, the tunnel widened. And there it was, the original chapel, long forgotten, built generations before the one above it, its ceiling lower, its pews unburned but rotted with time. A great stone pulpit stood in the center, where a figure cloaked in ash stood waiting. Not alive, not fully dead. Its face was hidden behind a veil of hymnal pages, stitched together with strands of human hair. Its hands held an old Bible, bound in something far too supple to be animal leather. Ellis dropped to his knees. The tongue within his palm disintegrated into smoke and was inhaled through his screaming mouth. Then he rose, still Ellis, but no longer the man who once wore a badge. "Brothers, sisters, faithful ashes," he intoned, voice now deep and layered with tones not his own. "Tonight we finish the song. The silence has bled long enough. From the sides of the chamber, the walls shivered, and from within, the congregation emerged. Not spirits this time, but flesh, hollow, half-formed beings birthed from the earth itself. Their hands were melted, their faces stretched like wax. Yet they bowed their heads in unison. They were the 80. Clara trembled. "Ellis, you don't have to." He turned to her sharply, and for a moment, just a flicker, his true eyes returned. "Clara, run," before the final verse. But it was too late. The veil-faced preacher raised its hands, and the sermon began. The dead sang. But it was no hymn. It was the cry of the earth swallowing light. It was the sound of children burning. It was the weeping of mothers sealed behind chapel doors. It was the pastor's voice, gasping through smoke as he prayed with lungs full of fire. It was agony. Clara dropped to her knees, blood trickling from her ears. She tried to scream, but her voice was stolen. Ellis walked to the center and lifted the old Bible. Its pages fluttered on their own, faster and faster, until they stopped on a page with her name written in blood. Clara Beecham, the one who remained, the one who remembered. Clara looked up, wide-eyed. "Why me?" "Because you survived. And survival is the one sin this place cannot forgive." Suddenly, the floor cracked beneath her. Hands, burned and bone-white, reached up to pull her in. She screamed. But before she fell, Ellis stepped forward and pushed her back. The hands took him instead. Clara watched in horror as he was dragged downward. His body did not resist. His eyes looked back at her, filled with peace. Tell the world, this song must never be sung again." And then he was gone. The walls shook. The veil-faced preacher shrieked, a sound like splitting stone, and then burst into ash. The 80 collapsed, no longer bound by the melody. The chapel shook. Dirt rained down. The passage upward crumbled behind her. She ran, up broken stairs, through the cracked altar, out into the dawn mist. And behind her, the earth closed shut with a final, thunderous sigh. Clara emerged covered in soil and blood. The sun had risen, and the chapel ruins were different, peaceful. The scent of smoke was gone, the air clear. Birdsong returned. She looked down at her hands, still trembling, her ears still bleeding, but in her mind silence. Beautiful, unbearable silence. That night, she returned to town. She didn't speak for days, until the sheriff, concerned for her well-being, sat across from her and asked one question. "What really happened out there?" Clara looked at him, eyes hollow but steady. "I buried a song beneath the earth." He laughed, confused. She did not. "And if anyone ever digs it up again, this town won't burn next time. The world will." The morning after the final bell tolled, nothing in Coldwater moved. The mist had thickened, shrouding the remains of St. Luke's in a veil like mourning lace. No bird sang. No wind rustled through the trees. It was as if the entire land had fallen into hushed prayer, or held its breath. Marshal Crane stood at the edge of the ruined foundation, eyes fixed on the scorched pulpit where the choir once sang. His boots crunched over blackened earth, but no ash rose beneath him. The fire had left not even cinders behind, just silence. Reverend Cotton's Bible, untouched by flame, rested atop a charred pew frame. Crane opened it slowly, thumbing past empty pages. Blank, blank. All the scripture had been erased, as if heaven had revoked its word. But wedged between two pages was a note, faded, written in ink that bled through like dried blood. "Those who sing loudest in life shall echo deepest in death." It was signed with a symbol, not a name. A cross, inverted, ringed in thorns. Crane took it to the town clerk, who turned pale. He'd seen that symbol before in old land records from 1819, on a deed from when the church grounds were sold, to a group simply labeled the Chorale Society. But that society had no names, no living members, no descendants, just the phrase, "Their worship shall consume." In the weeks that followed, Coldwater emptied. Children cried out at night of voices in the walls, and one boy said he'd been asked to join the final rehearsal. Livestock refused to go near the church grounds. A well digger struck something deep underground. Not rock, not wood, but bone. Layer after layer of it, arranged in a spiral, like a staircase descending into the dark. Cranes sealed the site, but the damage was done. The few who remained in Coldwater heard it one last time. One Sunday before dawn, a sound rose from the ruins of St. Luke's, not screams, but singing. 80 voices, lifting in unison. The same hymn as always, the one with no known origin. Its words carried on the fog, drifting across the fields like a requiem. Then silence. Forever. Crane vanished that day. His boots were found beside the pulpit's ashes. His badge was fused to the Bible's spine. No footprints led away. Only one final entry in his notebook was recovered. The church never burned. It simply opened its mouth. Years passed. Trees grew over the bones of Coldwater. The town faded from maps. But travelers say that if you stand where St. Luke's once stood, at precisely 3:17 a.m., you'll hear the faintest music. Not loud, not clear, but unmistakably human. And if you listen too long, you might start humming along. What would you do if your town buried a choir it couldn't silence? Would you stay when the voices began to hum beneath the floorboards? Would you keep your faith when the hymns kept playing long after the organ burned to ash? Coldwater was just a town until it became a memory, then a legend, then a warning. Some believe the fire was an accident. Others believe it was divine judgment. But the truth may be something far older and far more patient. What happened to those 80 souls? Perhaps they weren't taken. Perhaps they were invited. If this story echoed something deep inside you, some curiosity you can't quite explain, then like, share, and subscribe for more tales pulled from the forgotten corners of history. And remember, some churches are built to praise. Others are built to feed. And some songs, once sung, never truly end.